Hello and welcome to this sixth in our series of expert briefings for this fiscal year at the Parkinson's Disease Foundation. We're delighted to have you all on the line. I see that there's 861 people registered for this session today, and they come from 19 countries, so this is genuinely a worldwide presentation in all the senses, including the worldwide reputation of our speaker today, who we're delighted to have. Our title today, as you all know, is going to be Improving Communication in Parkinson's Disease, with a subtitle, One Voice, Many Listeners. I'm advised to advise you that you can download the PowerPoint slides from our website and from the reminder email that you should have received this morning for this talk. So please feel free to do that. That'll make your experience easier and more and richer. In this series, which I know because many of you are regulars, many of you have attended before, but for those who have not, in this series, we're now in our fourth year, we try to cover some of the most important topics in Parkinson's, and we take those topics, a selection of them, from the people who are the main investors in it, namely the people with Parkinson's and their caregivers and friends who join us for these webinars. So the selection, including this very original and very important selection for today's talk, is from the surveys and the pickup that we get from our friends and colleagues in this country, the United States, and also throughout the world. So we are grateful for all the help you've given us in composing this program. I also want to thank our sponsors for the series that make the whole thing possible. Three terrific companies in the Parkinson's space: AbbVie Incorporated, Teva Neuroscience, and UCB Inc. Three great companies involved in Parkinson's. The editorial control is entirely that of the Parkinson's Disease Foundation, but the financial support is entirely because of these great companies and their faith in us and their interest in this field. I just want to say, finally, for those of you who haven't visited our website, this is only, of course, one of the bits of work that we do in Parkinson's. We have a range of other educational, advocacy, and research activities, which you can find detailed on our website at www.pdf.org. Please visit any time and give us a call if you want if you have any questions. It's now my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker for today, Ms. Angela Roberts-South. She is an expert in cognition and communication, especially with respect to frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body spectrum disorders, including Parkinson's disease. She has some very impressive letters after her name, almost as many letters as there are in her double-barrel name, and she clearly is a world authority in this subject. She's also studying for the PhD at Western University in Ontario, Canada, and comes with a great deal of experience and academic training to this very, very important topic. She works with the center, which is named for one of our colleague organizations in the United States, the National Parkinson Foundation, and the National Parkinson Foundation Center of Excellence, which is in London, Ontario. And she hails from Tennessee. We learned just a few minutes ago originally, been in Canada for 10 years, and we're just absolutely thrilled to recognize her for this topic, which is so important, and the first time I think we've done it in this series, so we're delighted to have such a terrific exponent of the subject to lead us in this very important hour. So, Ms. Roberts-South, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott, and thank you to Parkinson's Disease Foundation for arranging for this talk. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share and exchange this information with everyone this afternoon. I'll start with just a few thank yous and acknowledgments just for funding support and the support of those people that I work with on a daily basis. Hopefully today's talk you'll find interesting, and we have a few objectives for this afternoon. The first is to really understand the complex dynamics of communication in Parkinson's disease. And the other objectives are really around focusing on helpful strategies and ways that we can manage not only the speech and voice disorders that occur in Parkinson's disease, but also communication in a broader sense. One of my favorite quotes is by Stephen Hawking, and he once said that communication is the essence of what makes us human, and in my profession, I truly believe that. So I wanted to start today by defining communication. So communication really is an exchange of concepts, ideas, and messages. It's the mechanism by how we not only establish relationships, but how we maintain and change relationships with others in our lives. And it can take on multiple forms. Sometimes it's social in terms of our interaction with others, and in other opportunities we have more agenda or transactional types of communication where you're trying to convince someone or set an agenda for a particular conversation. In Parkinson's disease and in individuals who don't have Parkinson's disease, communication is complex and it's multidimensional. In Parkinson's disease, we have for a very long time now known about and focused in our research on the aspects of speech and voice that are disrupted in Parkinson's disease. And certainly these are a significant part of living with Parkinson's. However, with more information, we now realize that communication in Parkinson's disease is disrupted at multiple levels, not only speech and voice, but also in terms of language or the rules that we use to put together words into sentences and sentences into conversation. We know that cognition can be disrupted, or our thought processes, thinking processes, planning, and problem solving can be disrupted. And we also know that sensory components of communication, such as hearing, vision, and touch, can be affected not only in Parkinson's, but just by age-related changes as well. I'll start a little bit today by talking about some of the cognition changes that can occur that affect communication in Parkinson's disease. And these are changes that we can see early in the disease, even at the same time that there's the development of motor symptoms. So they're not necessarily only a component of later disease stages or not something that's necessarily only a component in the context of dementia. So we can see cognitive changes early in the disease as well, even in the absence of dementia. And some of these changes include changes to mental flexibility or challenges in being able to generate multiple solutions or new solutions to a problem. Other aspects of cognition that can affect communication include the ability to focus or to attend to conversation or communication as it's occurring between multiple individuals. We know that processes of memory can also be disrupted early in the disease. And many of these processes, such as verbal memory or memory for words, and also a construct that we call working memory, are critical for language and critical for communicating. And we can often see them disrupted early in the disease with very subtle and mild changes, but still changes that can affect communication. Language is another area that we can see disrupted early on in Parkinson's disease, and some of those early changes include challenges in retrieving words out of our mental dictionary, or what we call our lexicon. In all the years I've practiced, and one of the things that actually drove me back to pursue my PhD was this common concern that was articulated by people with Parkinson's saying, you know, I know the word that I want to say, but I just can't get it out. I just can't find that right word. And that was actually what drove me back into this area of research. And we do know that there are challenges getting words out of the mental dictionary. Interestingly, we think that individuals with Parkinson's disease may have more challenges getting verbs or action language out of that mental dictionary than they do nouns, which is something that we're trying to understand more each day with a whole new series of studies that have come out. Other components of language that can be disrupted early on include challenges in processing complex sentences, as well as challenges getting information out of communication that is emotional information. People with Parkinson's can have challenges getting emotional information out of facial expressions produced by others, from emotional words such as happy or sad or angry, and as well as voice changes that are meant to communicate information as well. Speech and voice changes are prevalent in Parkinson's disease, and an overwhelming number of individuals with Parkinson's, about 90%, will experience some changes in voice or some changes in their ability to make speech sounds over the course of the disease. And we really think this isn't just an issue of slowness or rigidity in terms of stiffness of muscles or slowness of movement, but this is an internal scaling problem, what we call a scaling problem, which means that something about the changes in the brain with Parkinson's make it challenging for people with Parkinson's to think about how loud their voice needs to be, or think about how large the movements of the tongue and the jaw need to be in order to produce speech sounds clearly. So we think about this as more of an internal cueing problem and not just a slowness or a rigidity issue. Some of these changes include reduced loudness or having a quieter voice. Other changes can include having a breathy or a hoarse voice. We know that in Parkinson's disease, some individuals will have a slowing down of speech rate, while others actually have an increase in speech rate. So about 6 to 13% of individuals with Parkinson's develop this very fast speech rate that we call tachyphemia, which is almost, it gets so fast that people begin to stumble over their speech sounds and can sound a little bit like the speech that we hear in individuals who stutter. When we think about the processes of language and cognition and speech and voice, they certainly don't exist in isolation, and this is particularly true in Parkinson's disease, where we know that these processes interact so that the more challenging a task is from a language and cognitive standpoint, it may actually interfere with the speech task itself or challenges with movement and walking. So we really think about these processes as being interactive. And researchers are starting to study this a bit more in terms of trying to understand what happens when we walk and talk at the same time. That old adage of can you chew gum and walk at the same time. And people are trying to understand how this notion of movement and walking and motor task actually affect how we communicate, because this really does hit what we do on a daily basis. And what we know from some of this work is that certainly speech volume can reduce, or your voice can get quieter underneath certain types of motor demands. So the more taxing the motor task is, particularly when it's combined with a high-level language task like producing very long or complex sentences, we can actually see speech volume reduce in those contexts. We know that for certain tasks that speech intelligibility will actually reduce as well. So speech may not be as clear when you're talking while performing some motor tasks that are particularly challenging. And we know that not only do we have these changes in volume and changes in clarity, but there are long pauses. So when people are walking and having a conversation and talking at the same time, we see this increase in the duration of breaks or pauses that they take in their communication. And at times, we also see changes in the walking pattern and changes in balance as a function of trying to talk at the same time. So it really does affect both the walking component as well as the talking component. We've looked at this interaction effect of communication changes as well during conversation. So what happens when people are actually conversing with not just one person, but two people or three people, and having to think of multiple ideas at the same time and monitor the conversation? And we know that there are definite changes with this type of communication in people with Parkinson's, and that they can occur quite early. And some of those changes include just having more challenge at formulating your ideas in terms of what you want to say. So it may be accurate, but it may take you longer to formulate your ideas. This can lead to what we call impaired turn-taking because, again, the pauses are so long, these gaps in time where the person with Parkinson's is needing to try to plan or formulate what they want to say and how they want to say it, that it can lead to some challenges with listeners or conversation partners knowing when it's their turn to speak. So we get this impaired back and forth or turn-taking component in conversation. We know that for some individuals with Parkinson's that they actually produce less language, so they just don't say as much. And not only do they not say as much in terms of reduced output, but the information or content behind what they say may not be as rich as it was prior to when they developed Parkinson's. And we also have this added complication of challenges in using gestures. So I'm a huge hand talker, and when we first started talking about putting together this webinar, I felt challenged by the fact that, oh, what will I do with my hands, and how will I use them when I'm doing this talk? And so gestures are very important when we're communicating. And the reduced ability for individuals with Parkinson's to use gestures to support their communication certainly also affects this notion of the dynamic of communication in Parkinson's. So in my research and in my clinical practice, when I actually work with clients and their families, I really tend to lean toward what we call a social approach for communication disorders. And this is an approach we've kind of developed in our research lab here at Western. And we've borrowed it from the stroke world in terms of people who work with aphasia, which is a language issue that occurs following stroke. For a long time in Parkinson's disease, we have focused predominantly on these mechanisms of speech and voice, and we really have taken a very one-dimensional approach, which is if we just make people louder, then we make them better at communicating. But that really doesn't account for some of these other effects that we see in language planning and trouble thinking of the words you want to use. And so the approach that I try to use and that we're indeed working on from a research perspective is this notion of a social approach, where we think about the components of both sending a message and receiving a message, that both are important. And at any one point in time, the person with Parkinson's is both a sender of a message and is also receiving a message from a partner. When we work with clients and their families, we truly work with clients and everyone that they communicate with. So we believe that everybody involved in a communication dynamic has a role in the success and the failure of whether or not a message is communicated. So I don't just work with the person who has Parkinson's disease, but here in our lab we work with people who have Parkinson's disease as well as their wife or their husband, their grandchildren, and maybe it's even a friend that they have coffee with every Tuesday, all with the goal of trying to optimize communication. We think about not only the impairment itself, so the voice change, the speech change, the language change, or the cognitive change, but we also think about the preserved ability. So not just what's wrong, but what is actually still preserved. What are your strengths in terms of communicating? And we think about the environment. Is it a noisy environment, a quiet environment? Is there lots of distraction in the environment? So things that may affect communication. And we always take a multidimensional approach, and I really think this is the fundamental shift that we need to make in terms of working with communication disorders and Parkinson's, is that a cookbook approach or a one-size-fits-all approach really doesn't work. We need to be thinking about multiple tools in our toolkit, multiple ways and multiple approaches for helping people with communication disorders and Parkinson's, so that we really optimize their communication, not just in our clinics where we're working with them, but in every situation or in every environment in which they might be communicating. So I'm going to attempt today to kind of give you this broad overview of the tools that we actually do have in our toolbox. What are those exercises and devices and strategies that we have that allow speech-language pathologists and others working with people who have communication disorders and Parkinson's to really put together a toolbox for the person with Parkinson's and their family to try to optimize communication? And certainly exercise is a component of that, and we have some very well-designed and well-evidenced, well-researched programs for exercise in Parkinson's disease. And one of the ones that we've had around for the longest duration and probably has the most evidence associated with it is the Lee Silverman voice treatment therapy. And this was designed by Lori Ramig and Cynthia Fox. We've had it for almost 20 years, and there's great evidence to support that this treatment really does work. It's an intensive exercise program that is directed at improving voice loudness, articulation and speech clarity, facial expression, and there is also some evidence that it may help swallowing. It's a systematic approach that is really directed at recalibrating loudness and the amount of effort it takes to be loud in various communication situations. However, it's not, again, the component here is we're not looking at one solution for everyone, and there are some individuals that have more challenges using these types of exercise programs. For example, people with more advanced disease states or people with more severe cognitive changes associated with their Parkinson's may have more challenges not only learning these programs and strategies, but also applying them afterwards. And as well, sometimes no matter how hard somebody works and how loud they're able to get their voice in the clinical setting, they may have challenges in communication situations that are outside the clinical setting. So we know that even in the best circumstances where people do really well with these programs, that it may not work in all communication situations. We have some other evidence coming out in terms of research programs that extend beyond the Lee-Silverman voice treatment, and one of those is with a new device and a training program called Expiratory Muscle Strength Training, which was developed by Christine Sapienza and her group in Florida. And this basically works by supporting the respiratory support and the respiratory effort or the breath support that's needed for communicating in Parkinson's. It has been purported to work with speech volume and also reported to have some changes on swallowing function as well, similar to LSVT. It's a program that involves a specialized device where you change the resistance each week as you're working at building your breath support for speech. And it's largely an at-home program that takes about 30 minutes a day over the course of about 4 weeks. So we have this great growing literature now that supports the use of exercise in terms of improving speech and voice in Parkinson's. Some of the exercise programs that we use extend beyond more traditional exercise programs and optimize an effect that's a natural effect that we call the Lombard Effect. The Lombard Effect really is our natural tendency to increase our voice volume anytime we're in a noisy environment. So if you're in a crowd of people, that tendency that you feel to raise your voice up to speak above the crowd, that is the Lombard Effect. It's a natural effect that our brain uses to enable us to be able to adjust our voice depending on the background noise. And we have several studies now that support the fact that despite the presence of low voice volume in people who have Parkinson's disease, that this notion of the Lombard effect is still largely preserved in Parkinson's. And so people are working on therapy approaches that help to optimize the Lombard effect for actually increasing voice volume. Some people have done this through devices. So we actually have a device. This is one called a Speech 5 that was developed by Jessica Huber and colleagues. And it's a small device that you wear in your ear, similar to a hearing aid, and it actually senses when you begin to speak. And at the time you begin to speak, it actually places into your ear, feeds into your ear this multi-talker background noise that simulates you being in a crowded room. And as such, then that forces you to use your voice in a louder way. The nice thing about these devices, and even the Lombard Effect as a whole, is unlike LSVT and some of the other more scriptive exercise programs, you don't per se have to think about being loud. So for those who have more cognitive challenges in thinking about being loud or focusing and monitoring being loud, this really almost in a way forces you to automatically be louder without thinking about it, because it plays this background noise into your ear, and just by a natural reaction or natural accommodation, you raise your voice volume louder. It's a background noise that you can hear, only you can hear, so it's not necessarily anything that your conversation partners can hear. We have other devices that do something similar. This is called the iParkinsons, which is actually an iPhone app, which follows a very similar approach, optimizing this notion of the Lombard effect. And so it senses how loud your voice is using the mic that is on the phone itself. And so what it does is sense the loudness of your voice and actually delivers, again, this multi-talker background noise into your ear that only you can hear at a level that's appropriate in order for you to adjust your voice volume above it. So again, without thinking about it really, it plays this noise into your ear and you automatically accommodate or adjust your voice loudness. So a couple of devices and a couple of therapies that kind of optimize this notion of the Lombard effect, which can work for people who have a greater challenge in focusing or thinking about being loud. One of the most challenging behaviors that can occur and that we have to manage in terms of speech changes in Parkinson's is this excessive rate that I talked about earlier, where about 6 to 13% of people generate this very fast or rapid speech rate, almost to the point where they sound as if they are stuttering. It's quite frustrating to people who have Parkinson's because the minute they can slow their voice down, their speech becomes almost perfectly clear. It at least is much easier to listen to, but it's a very hard thing for them to do, to just think about being slower. It's almost as if, again, similar to what we see in walking, where we begin to trip over our steps because the step becomes so short, the step length does. This is a similar kind of phenomenon in speech. Behavioral approaches such as pausing or training to be slower or just thinking about being slower really don't work. We do here again have a few devices that can help. And this is a device that, as speech pathologists, we've borrowed from the field of stuttering, this notion of altered auditory feedback or delayed auditory feedback. And again, you can get this in an actual device. It can be a device that you carry, or small, as in a small hearing aid size device, or even as an iPhone app. There's multiple softwares out that kind of produce this effect. But delayed auditory feedback basically takes your own voice and plays it back to you at a very subtle delay. Again, no one else in your environment can hear this, just you, just the person who's wearing the device. Like the Lombard Effect, which forces our voice to become louder, delayed auditory feedback, when you play your own voice back to yourself at a very subtle delay, forces your voice to become, or your speech to become, slower. So without you even thinking about it, this natural reaction or this natural accommodation in the brain when you're listening to yourself at a delay will shift your speech rate down. So you don't have to think about being slower. You will just become slower. It's fascinating to use these devices on people who have severe dysarthria or severe challenges with fast speech rate, because within minutes of applying a delayed auditory feedback device, we've got their rate shifted down. It's slower, and their speech becomes markedly easier to understand. Now, it doesn't work really well once you take the device off, so you do have to wear the device all the time, but it is an option. A non-device option that we also use in terms of regulating speech rates are these things that we call pacing boards. And pacing boards are literally just small, even index card size devices that you do. We put crosses on them, or here you see circles on the ones that I have showing to you. And basically the principle here is that you point to the circle, or you point to whatever target is on the page with every word that you want to say. So here in this top picture, you have may, I, have, When you touch each one of those words, or when you make the point of touching the circle each time you say a word, it will automatically slow your speech rate down. Now, here again, these do work and work very well, and almost instantly once we put them in place, you'll see an improvement in speech intelligibility. But they have to be used all the time. And I do find, as well as my colleagues find, that you often have to remind people to use these types of devices and remind them how to use them, that they do need to touch each one of the circles. But it does work very well and is a very quick fix and is a very portable fix for people who have excessively fast speech rate. As we talked earlier, exercise programs are great in Parkinson's, and we have a lot of literature that shows that they work. However, they don't work necessarily equally as well for everyone who uses them, and they may not, even people who've optimized the ability to use those exercise programs, may have challenges in certain situations. And this is when a voice amplifier is nice. Voice amplifiers can be used all the time in the cases of someone who really has trouble getting their voice loud enough even after they've been through a therapy program. Or they can be used just some of the time or as needed for people who can raise their voice loudly enough in some situations, but not in all situations. So this is a small mic that you wear and a speaker that most people tend to wear around their waist, and it simply acts to pick up your voice and amplify it for those who are around you and listening. They come in various sizes, and the size generally kind of equates to how loud the device may get without distortion. And many insurance companies, as well as funding agencies around the world, actually help to support paying for these devices for people with Parkinson's. For individuals who just have challenge really limited to the telephone, there are also telephones that you can purchase that amplify not only the incoming voice for someone who may have a hearing loss, but also amplify the outgoing voice. So there are telephones that will increase your voice volume by about 10 to 20 decibels to the listener who's on the other side of the line. So for people who just have challenges on the telephone, this may be a good option. In my own practice, I've of late have really started partnering with some of my audiology colleagues to use FM systems, what we call FM systems, for voice amplification in people who have Parkinson's, as well as other disorders where there's a quieter voice. And these devices have been around for a long time, again, used by our colleagues in audiology, not so much used by speech pathologists. And they're nice because the person with Parkinson's actually wears this transmitter around their neck, which you can see in the picture on the right-hand side of your slide, and their listener or their conversational partner wears a receiver around their neck with a tiny little insert in their ear or a tiny little set of headphones. This actually eliminates the need for a mic to be worn at the mouth. So the mic is actually, in a way, located in this transmitter and picks up the sound of the person with Parkinson's voice and actually amplifies it to a desirable level. I actually really enjoy these systems because they allow for a more personal type of amplification, meaning that if you're having a conversation with 6 different people at your house, each of those people can wear one of these receivers. So you can have one transmitter and multiple receivers. And each person can set the volume level that works for them. The other thing I like about them is for interactions over dinner or conversations that are happening at the family dinner table. You don't have this mic that's in front of your face while you're trying to eat. You don't have a speaker that's hidden down below the table, where the table's blocking the sound. So it actually really allows for a more personal and an effective amplification dynamic in the home. These devices are wireless and will also enable families to be able to better communicate room to room. So if a partner is in the kitchen washing dishes and the person with Parkinson's is in the living room, you can actually pick up the sound of their voice through that receiver, which isn't as easy to do with just a typical voice amplifier. So these systems also exist in what we call loop systems, which can be used for an entire room and not just one-to-one amplification. So as I hope you guys are gaining kind of my perspective today, one strategy or one approach doesn't work for everyone. And so I have clients that have gone through Lee Silverman. They do aggressive voice therapy or speech therapy, loudness therapy, and they also use an amplifier. In addition to that, we may also work with they and their partners in terms of designing very specific strategies that work for them that enhance communication. So again, a multiple-pronged approach to enhancing communication in Parkinson's. The strategies that we often supply to family members and to caregivers really are designed to minimize the amount of effort it takes to communicate and get a message across. They're there to optimize strengths, and they're there to reveal competence. We work with both the person with Parkinson's and their partners on an ongoing basis. And one of the first things that we always assess is hearing and vision. We communicate with our ears and we communicate with our eyes. And the most critical of these really is hearing. Hearing loss is the third most common chronic condition in individuals over the age of 65 years. And we know that the mean age of Parkinson's is in the mid-50s, so certainly a lot of people with Parkinson's and their conversation partners will have some degree of hearing loss. Interestingly, I did a talk about 6 weeks ago, and I took an audiology colleague of mine, and we tested the hearing of everybody who was at this conference, so around 40 or 50 people at this conference. 85% of the people who were communication partners, spouses, caregivers of the person with Parkinson's had a degree of hearing loss that was severe enough to warrant wearing a hearing aid. And this was combined with a room full of people with Parkinson's who had very quiet voices. So this isn't just about the notion of the quiet voice. It's also about optimizing the receiver, the person who's getting these messages in, to ensure that they can optimize their hearing or their understandability with this softer speech pattern. And we know that even mild losses of 25 to 30 decibels have a substantial impact on understandability. So when we're talking about hearing and optimizing hearing in these communication dynamics of really families where they're living with someone who has Parkinson's disease, we really focus on this notion of it's not just the person with Parkinson's disease and the person who's listening to them, but it's everyone in the dynamic. We also know that when people with Parkinson's disease who have language and cognitive challenges have additional hearing challenges, this just makes it all worse. So they may have speech and voice and language and cognition challenges associated with their Parkinson's disease that are made substantially worse by the addition of a hearing impairment. So we really do encourage people to have their hearing checked and to try to optimize that. So along those lines comes my next slide in terms of talking about optimizing voice output. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of using therapy, using an amplifier, using one of the devices that looks at Lombard Effect or delayed auditory feedback to slow speech rate down, but do whatever you can to get the speech signal itself optimized. For me, this means a changing plan across the duration of the disease. So at the early stages of the disease, I may have someone who's perfect for the Lee Silverman voice treatment, and that's what we work on. By mid-stage, they may need their Lee Silverman voice treatment plus a voice amplifier in certain conditions. And in later stages, particularly if cognition or becomes more of an issue or dementia develops, then we may be looking more at going to a voice amplifier totally. So I don't just see patients at one spectrum in time, and I think this is another way that we need to reconceptualize care for communication disorders in Parkinson's, is it really is an ongoing intervention, an ongoing process of changing strategies. As well, we advocate for optimizing the input to the listener, so FM systems or hearing aids, and always make sure you position yourself face-to-face with the person when you're able. Talking to the back of someone's head is not a way to optimize communication. They can't see your mouth movements, and it really does affect the signal in terms of how well you're able to hear it. So always try to position yourself face-to-face. Minimize distractions where able, especially if there's an important message to communicate. So don't communicate the most important message of the day, which may be about an investment you need to make or having the roof reshingled, while there's a lawnmower going outside, the television's on, and someone else has a radio blaring in the house. So do your best to try to minimize those distractions, which can come in a variety of ways. Lighting in and of itself can be a distraction. If you're trying to talk to someone who's sitting in front of a window and there's bright sunlight coming through the window, then you can't see their mouth movements, which will affect your ability to communicate with them. Always allow extra time. Communication in Parkinson's disease is challenging enough, but this we know. If enough time is allowed, the message is almost always accurate. The problem is we often don't allow enough time for that communication exchange. So I often make the suggestion just to reduce the amount of information that has to be processed. So don't present so much information at one time. Ensure whether you're the person with Parkinson's and you're speaking or you're speaking to someone with Parkinson's that you break information down into smaller chunks and you try to use a slower speech rate. It's important to mark a place in conversation. This is both the responsibility of the partner as well as the person with Parkinson's disease. So if I'm someone with Parkinson's, it's important that I say, hey, wait a minute, I've got something really important I want to say here, but I need a bit more time to formulate my thoughts. Whether you actually say that or you give a signal that means that to your friends and family members, it lets them know that you want to hold that space. You don't want the conversation to move on yet because you have something you want to contribute there. Conversation partners can also do the same thing. Hey, guys, let's hold on a minute. I know Joe's trying to think of what he wants to say, and it's really important to him. Otherwise, what tends to happen is the conversation patterns can move so fast among individuals that the person with Parkinson's actually gets left out of the conversation, not because they don't want to communicate or because what they have to say isn't important, but just because they don't have time to formulate their thoughts and a chance to get into the conversation. A few other strategies that are common for us to suggest include verifying that the message was understood correctly. And again, this is true for both people with Parkinson's and people without Parkinson's. It's important to say to your doctor, so my next appointment is next Tuesday at 3 o'clock, just to make sure that you've understood that information correctly. And likewise, in a back-and-forth conversation exchange, it becomes important to say, hey, George, did I understand you correctly? You wanted spaghetti for dinner tonight. So it's just a very quick verification, especially if you're not sure that you've understood. It's a much better way of doing it than to say, I didn't understand you. Can you say that again? So trying to verify the message is a good strategy to follow. And also thinking about multiple ways of communicating messages. So not just depending on what's heard, but making sure that you not only tell somebody something, but you also write it down, that you've not only listened to it, but you've also written it down. We have a lot of interesting information coming out to tell us that, particularly when teaching exercise programs to people who have Parkinson's, that video is incredibly helpful. We now have some published literature from the swallowing world, as well as some colleagues of mine here at Western are working on the use of videos to teach exercise programs or to teach actually different gait patterns, so how to get unstuck during freezing of gait moments and whatnot. People who have the videos when they take them home and have the chance to rewatch those videos and also re-listen to the instructions from the therapist multiple times do much better at implementing the exercises and do a much better job at maintaining and carrying on those exercises even to the duration of 6 months of a year. And we've actually looked at the walking patterns of people when they got video instruction versus when they didn't. And the walking patterns are actually significantly better in those individuals who got the video instruction. So this notion that multiple modes of communicating is very important in Parkinson's disease, whether it's written, pictures, video, speaking, facial expressions. So finally, just to summarize for this afternoon, I'll revisit my quote from Stephen Hawking, which is that communication really is the essence of what makes us human. It is what allows us in Parkinson's not only to create new relationships with people, but to maintain and change the existing relationships. It is essential to the caregiving relationship, and it is essential to living a valued quality of life with Parkinson's. And I do think we need to rethink how we address communication disorders in PD. First, we need to deliver services not just to the person with Parkinson's, but also to their partners. We need to think in a multidimensional way, using a variety of strategies and approaches to optimize communication in a variety of situations, and no longer thinking about this as a cookbook approach, knowing that every situation and every environment may call for a different combination of strategies. And finally, we need to think about being dynamic and flexible and following individuals across the duration of the disease. We have some literature that shows us that people with Parkinson's generally get referred to speech-language pathologists either when they have trouble swallowing or at a single point in the disease, typically when their speech is so involved that we are losing some of those options that we have to work with them. And I think this is really a shame. I think we need to be following individuals across the duration, across the course of the disease, not just them, but their family, their communication dynamics, so that we can design treatments and interventions that meet their needs across the continuum. So with that, I will pass things back over to Mr. Elliott, and thanks everyone for sharing this information with me.
Thank you very much, Angela. That really was a terrific talk. We're very, very grateful. We have around 15-20 minutes to take some questions that have come through to us. If you're still itching to ask a question and you have a computer rather than just a telephone, you'll find a text messaging feature that's built into the lower left-hand corner of your viewer page. Click in the box below it, enter your question, click on send, and we'll get the question in our offices here in New York. We may not have time to answer it, but we will try and answer it afterwards with Angela's help, and so do keep the questions coming if you wish.
For sure.
I have first of all, Angela, just a very general question that came, I'm not sure where it came from, but I'm sure it was on many people's minds. Where, if we live in one of 19 countries who are listening to this presentation today, where do we find lists of people like you?
That's a good question. And the regulating, so a speech-language pathologist is a regulated health professional in most countries, which means that typically we have to be registered somewhere within the country. So there should be similar, sometimes we're housed underneath the medical colleges, sometimes we're housed underneath a larger government body like the NIH or the NHS, in the UK. But a couple of suggestions that I would have, and one of the challenges that we have is our education around Parkinson's disease in the speech-language pathology field is not always as good as we would like for it to be. So places where I would suggest starting to find a speech-language pathologist who probably has a bit more experience working with Parkinson's disease, not only from kind of the national regulating or accrediting bodies, but to look for a National Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence that's just similar to what I'm involved with here. Most of those programs have to have some form of a allied health network or professionals, not just physicians and nurses, but also physiotherapists and occupational therapists and speech pathologists like me who work alongside their centers. And so it may be there are multiple of those facilities around the world, and it may be that contacting one of those individuals will provide some help in finding someone in your area who can work with them. I know that often the Parkinson's support groups internationally will have connections to speech-language pathologists that they know, or at least contacts of where to find individuals within a particular country who have an interest in Parkinson's disease. And finally, I might suggest a local university. So if a university has a program in speech pathology, and many programs around the world do, then they may have contacts of individuals who work within an area who have an interest. So to summarize, kind of going to those bodies that organize those of us who have an interest in Parkinson's, so Parkinson's Disease Foundation, the National Parkinson's Foundation, individual support groups, universities, and then as well thinking about the regulating bodies that typically organized through the medical colleges as well, where likely speech-language pathologists are registered. Those who have an interest in doing the Lee Silverman voice treatment, I would refer to LSVT.org because they have a list of registered clinicians from all over the world if you have an interest specifically in that therapy. So I hope that helps.
Wonderful. What a terrific answer. My gosh. It's an encyclopedia. Very, very good. You may have thought, along with me, that Ms. Roberts-South had covered every possible manner of communication. If you did, you're wrong. There's one we are reminded from the country of Pakistan that she did not mention, and it is the question of lip reading.
Yeah.
What is the role of lip reading in communication, and what can people do if they wish to avail themselves of that to become to use it as a supplementary form of communication?
Yep, absolutely, and certainly was not, left out more for time than for an intentional leave out, because it is a very important component of communication. I alluded to that a bit when I said we communicate not only with our ears but with our eyes. And to a certain degree, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area as my colleagues are who work in the hearing sciences, but we all lip read when we're communicating with people. So we're constantly watching people's mouths and getting information from the shaping of their mouth as they're producing speech sounds. So you may do this very subconsciously, but certainly is a large component of communicating for certain, which is why part of my suggestions around always ensuring that you're face-to-face, ensuring that there's optimal lighting in a room so that you can actually see someone's face. Again, so that you're not trying to communicate with someone when they're sitting in front of a window with a bright light coming through, because you won't be able to see their mouth to support lip reading, which you may be doing subconsciously. In terms of teaching and training lip reading, that does vary a little bit country by country, but there are very scripted ways or very organized ways of teaching people how to be better at lip reading. One of the challenges in trying to lip read someone who has Parkinson's disease, and I will say that just as at the front end, is that oftentimes the degree of muscle movement in terms of degree of actually what we call amplitude of movement or degree of change in movement is not as great as it is in people who don't have Parkinson's. So again, that scaling issue means that overall their movements are smaller. it can make it more challenging to do lip reading with someone who has Parkinson's disease. Not that the person with Parkinson's disease has challenges lip reading, but you may have challenges using lip reading with someone who has Parkinson's because of those smaller movements. So they're not characteristic always or prototypical for exactly what we see in normal speech production. But if you do want to learn how to do lip reading, again, a speech-language pathologist can work with you on that. An audiologist often works with that. People who work within the hearing-impaired community, so teachers of the deaf or people who are instructors of individuals who have deafness, are also individuals who often teach lip reading. Universities will offer lip reading courses, as well as some, especially if you're looking at maybe coordinating yourself with a school for the deaf in the region where you live, then you likely would find someone there who could teach you about lip reading. And I do, if I remember correctly, I think there are a couple of online resources as well. They don't come to mind right now, but maybe I can supply those to you guys at PDF to put forward to answer that question in a little bit more depth. But yeah, lip reading, extremely important, maybe challenging as the disease progresses with someone who has Parkinson's, but certainly worth thinking about. Yep.
Great. Thank you very, very much. And there's a generic to what she was just saying about using PDF. If there are questions that we can answer later, she feeds them back through us. Do any of you and all of you feel free to contact us at PDF, and we'll try to answer the question there. We have two questions, Ms. Roberts-South, about LSVT, which obviously is a big game in town here.
For sure.
And you covered it very, very well. Different questions. One from Vero Beach in Florida. Lady would like to ask, what happens when the LSVT course begins to work a little less well? Because are there refresher courses or other things you can do, a booster shot of some kind that can enable you to continue to get the benefit that typically occurs in the first couple of years after the treatment? And then a separate point, but also connected with LSVT, this person from British Columbia in Canada is saying that he did not find though it helped him with his voice control and projection, LSVT did not help him with a problem he has of slurring his speech. And so we're wondering about, number one, boosting LSVT after the couple of years after you've had it, and two, the matter of slurring. Is there any way that or some other technique can be used to prevent slurring?
Sure, I'll try to take those on. The first question on kind of a refresher or a booster for LSVT, absolutely. We know that typically, and you're describing the kind of typical scenario where about 2 or 3 years after you've had your initial LSVT training, you kind of start to lose some of that calibration a little bit. It's combined also with the fact that the disease is changing, and so your actual abilities behind using the tools for LSVT may also be changing. It is absolutely appropriate and commonly employed where people revisit the initial clinician that they worked with, or again another LSVT certified clinician in their area for exactly that, what we call a refresher or a booster session in LSVT. Those typically are about a week to 2 in length. You don't typically, some individuals, depending on how far those skills have kind of gone backward, may be re-entered into a full course of treatment, but it's often not the case that you are. Typically it's just a very short course to get you recalibrated again. So if you had good effect from your LSVT the first time, nothing substantial has changed in your voice or in your diagnosis, then I would certainly say contact the clinician that you worked with initially or another LSVT clinician in your area for that rebooster piece. To follow up on the second question from BC, in terms of LSVT not being helpful, you know, and as I kind of mentioned in my coverage of that topic, some people find it's not as helpful as others. I always try to make sure, indeed, that people had a true LSVT approach. So there are people who kind of think they had LSVT, or they were with a clinician who said they were doing LSVT, and they may have been doing more of an LSVT-like approach. And we do know that when you vary from the intensity of the originally prescribed LSVT approach, that it may not work as well. So my first kind of caveat to that before we say it didn't work is to make sure you were truly with an LSVT certified therapist and were actually really getting LSVT, because I know in the market there are lots of people doing LSVT-like that may not be as effective. Secondly, it may be that the LSVT didn't work as well for you, and particularly this notion of slurring speech Again, without hearing your voice, it's a little bit hard for me to say whether that's related to rate or just articulatory precision. But regardless of the dysarthria type, so whether it's someone who stutters, which isn't a dysarthria per se, but whether it's someone who stutters or someone who has a dysarthria for any reason related to stroke or related to another condition related to Parkinson's disease, we do know that adjusting speech rate at a slower pace allows people to be able to articulate their sounds more clearly. And if you just think about it from a perspective of then the motor movements, the tongue and the lips and the jaw all have just more time to get to their target and where they need to be to produce a sound more clearly. And so I would suggest that probably, again, not hearing the speech sample, it's a little challenging for me to comment directly, but certainly things like rate control or working on reducing rate might be useful. It may be that just doing some very direct therapy on where those articulators need to be placed. So, for example, if it's the S sound or the CH sound, if it's a particular sound that's causing issues, then maybe just some direct work on where your tongue and jaw and lips go to make that sound so that you can increase the focus of that may be one way of kind of mitigating that issue. But certainly I would tend to go down the rate of thinking or go down the path of thinking reduced rate as a first strategy and then accommodating with some direct work on whatever speech sounds are more challenging. But you're right, LSVT doesn't always help, and it really does depend on the nature of the issue. So I hope that answers. I wish I could hear the person from BC speech. It might help me a little bit more, but I hope that's a good general answer anyways.
Very good one. Thank you. One of the marks of a good audience is that you are asking questions that supplement the excellent presentation we had. And I also want in that connection to credit our two screeners here, Valerie Holt and Eli Pollard, who have been screening the calls very well. So everything really does add to what our brilliant speaker has already said. And here's a couple of examples of this. From Costa Mesa, California, the questioner is saying, noting that the speaker was mentioning facial expressions as a very important part of communication. This questioner is saying, are there any programs or exercises that can help increase or improve one's ability to have facial expressions that can that supplement other communication methods?
A great question. The facial expressions are disrupted in Parkinson's at a couple of levels. One, the person with Parkinson's ability to express themselves by changing their facial expressions. There's also a challenge in being able to read the facial expressions of others, a point I didn't have a lot of opportunity to get into. So even when we work on improving facial expressions of the ability to smile better or use your eyes better, there's still this issue in Parkinson's disease of not always being able to receive that information well. To date, we don't have the therapies really that we would love to have to prove that we can improve facial expression in Parkinson's. A couple of things that I would say is, programs like LSVT as well are designed and are purported and do report improvements in facial expression as a component of that program. So not only louder voices, but also changes in facial expression. So that is one thing that I could suggest that maybe doing an LSVT style approach could help. What we don't think works particularly well is just doing a lot of facial stretching exercises. I've yet to see a concrete study that's come out that has shown that doing facial stretching exercises, smiling and opening the mouth wide, really that there's good supportive evidence to say that makes a difference. The second point that I would make is to make sure that you're optimally medicated as well, so that you work with your physician to ensure that your medications are at a level that support your motor movements and your muscle movements, being able to do what they need to do. But unfortunately, it is not our greatest area of knowledge yet in terms of very specific therapies that we have to make facial expression better. What I do suggest, though, is for when you are communicating with someone who has Parkinson's, that you try to, in a way, slightly exaggerate or animate your facial expressions, and to make sure that if you are the person talking to someone who has Parkinson's, that you ensure that your facial expressions match your message. There's this notion in hypomimia, not hypomimia, but this notion in mimia where when we're talking with someone, we tend to mimic their facial expressions. So when your partner has great facial expressions and when your partner is really expressing themselves through facial expressions, you as a person with Parkinson's disease likely subconsciously may try to mimic that, and your own facial expressions may be a little bit stronger as well. So here again is another consideration where the dynamic or the communication dynamic becomes very important.
Great. With your forbearance, Ms. Roberts-South, I'm going to extend the session by 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay. I can't ask everybody's permission.
That's fine with me, and I tend to take forever to answer questions as well. It's a clinical thing. I'm sorry.
They're wonderful, but so we will press on and give you another 10 minutes. That's okay, and give us time for 3 or 4 more questions. Here's one that's one of a kind on the subject of deep brain stimulation. This person from Torrance, California, has the DBS for Parkinson's and is wondering whether any of these voice amplification features or devices might not work with DBS and the electronics of DBS.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we certainly know that post-DBS people can experience more speech and voice changes for sure. The amplifiers in particular, I know that I've had detailed conversations with our neurosurgeons here in London about whether or not they in any way interfere with kind of the electronics back and forth. And I think certainly I think we're going to have to do more testing in this area for sure, because I think individuals who, we have more individuals getting the DBS surgery and having the implants done, and so it is becoming an important issue that I think we need to address. Presently, I've not seen any issues between the typical voice amplifiers with the mic and the speaker. So those I think are okay. In terms of the FM systems, that could create some different issues, and I recently have started, and again, give me a month and I can give you a better answer on this, because we are using these devices now quite a bit more. I have started a conversation with some of the manufacturing companies who actually produce these devices, the FM systems, to let's just double check and make sure that either nothing in the DBS system itself may interfere with the FM system's ability to work, or that nothing in the FM system may affect the DBS device. Presumably it won't, and that's because it's a very similar technology to kind of what we see in hearing aids, and we don't necessarily see an interference there. But it is definitely worth asking. I think probably the likelihood might be that the answer to that question is going to be no, but give me a month's time and I can provide you more information to that. Relative to the Lombard Effect devices and some of the iPhone apps that we talked about, the iPhone likely, no, again, would not have a disruption. The Lombard Effect device, the Speech 5 that I covered, I'm not sure about that one, but I will tell you I'm happy to contact Dr. Huber and ask her that question directly and get that answer back to you. So.
Great. I just reminded by our producer here that since we have a couple more questions, those of you who are leaving on time, please, before you leave, do take a minute to complete our online survey. You should find it posted on your screen. It's up right now, and the feedback really helps us to improve the webinar series and to get new topics. So please do spend that minute, if you can, before you leave to complete that survey so we can use it. Just back to another couple of final questions for you, Ms. Roberts-South. The one thing I don't think you raised, we got a question here from West Hartford in Connecticut in the USA, is the use of singing. I think the person is asking singing as a therapy for communications rather than singing itself as a communication technique. Though, of course, singing does, in fact, have that function. So maybe you can answer either or both versions of that.
I can. It's interesting because I have a lot of my clients with Parkinson's disease who will tell me I still do very well with singing, but I don't do as well with my speech. And we do know that singing and speech are different components of a similar system. So they use the same muscles, that's for sure, but we have a rhythmic component to singing that sometimes may result in this kind of paradoxical effect of people being able to sing more easily than they can speak. Singing of itself as a therapy, I mean, certainly a couple of things around that. We don't have any large-scale studies yet. I think there are a couple of small studies that are single-case studies that have looked at this, but we don't have any large-scale studies yet that show us that singing as a therapy is better than the traditional treatments that we have, such as something like Lee Silverman voice treatment. And so I hate to kind of keep coming back to that one, but it is, at least at this point in time, one of our better evidence therapies. Or even some of the therapies that we have that use amplifiers are lumbar devices. So we don't have any hard evidence yet that singing as a therapy actually improves voice quality. There is some, and some logic to the fact that if you were a singer before and you had this very well-trained and well-tuned voice, that you might be a little more resistant to some of the changes in speech and voice that can happen with Parkinson's. So it might take longer for those to kick in just because you have a finer-tuned system. Thinking about someone as well who's an athlete might be able to take some of the early motor changes and walking with a little bit more grace or with a little bit more ease because their body is so already well-toned and well-conditioned. So the voice system also can be well-toned and well-conditioned with singing. If you go down the path, and the one thing I'm going to caution here of thinking about singing because you find it does help for you, or singing in a choir is both a social activity as well as an opportunity to work your voice, do make sure that you're doing that with appropriate breath support, because one of the things that can happen in Parkinson's disease is we tend to use our larynx too much, or we squeeze it with too much effort and tension, which particularly in the domain of singing can actually cause more harm than it does good in terms of causing some changes in the laryngeal system that we don't want, so rubbing little ulcers and causing changes to the voice box that we wouldn't want. So if you're a well-trained singer, you probably already have that underneath your belt and know how to use your voice properly. But if you're not a well-trained singer and you just decide to go down that path to help make your voice stronger, then do make sure you're at least working with someone who has a bit of experience in terms of voice coaching or consulting a speech pathologist so that you learn how to use your voice in that context so you don't do more harm than good. But presently, it's a great question because a lot of people talk about it. Presently, we don't have any large studies that tell us that it's more efficacious or better than what we already have in terms of our typical voice therapies.
What an answer. Great way to finish. Before you all leave, a couple of quick public service advertisements, and before I once more thank our speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank publicly our sponsors for the series, AbbVie, Inc., which was formerly the Abbott Pharmaceuticals, now named AbbVie, Teva Neuroscience, and UCB. Thank you, all those three fine companies, for supporting the series, making the whole thing possible. Second, if you or someone you know, love, and are with, and would also like to take advantage of what you've just heard, wish to access this via the Internet, you will find it through our website, www.pdf.org, beginning Tuesday, June 11th. That's 1 week from now. This entire webinar will be up on our site. If you've already communicated with us, in other words, if you're on this call now, we'll be sending you an email when it's available so you can listen to it again. If you know anybody and want to tell them this, please do, and have them access it separately. We'd be delighted to have them too. If there's anyone on this webinar who is seeking CEU continuing education credits, we're sending an email this afternoon with a link so you can take the required test. So you won't get it immediately, but sometime this afternoon you will, and you'll have what you need to go through those tests. Please be aware that our fifth series in the fifth year running will begin in September. It'll also be a 6-part series on topics that are of importance to people with Parkinson's. And this one's beginning with a talk by Gila Bronner from Israel, who is probably the world expert on sex therapy and Parkinson's, and the sex aspects of Parkinson's and how to better manage those. She'll be talking on Tuesday, September 10th, usual time, which is 1 p.m. Eastern Time, United States time, and you can do your calculations from there if you're somewhere else. And her topic, of course, is sex and Parkinson's disease. I think that completes the public service announcements, except just to say once more to Angela Brooksouth just what a wonderful job she's done with this terrific talk. If ever there was somebody who practices what she preaches, her skill as a communicator, and especially I was bowled over by the carefulness and comprehensiveness of the answers to questions, really shows that she is a communicator extraordinaire, and we're very, very grateful to her for this wonderful talk, as I'm sure I speak for everybody on this webinar. So have a wonderful summer, all of you, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, and whatever it is when you're in the Southern Hemisphere. And we'll catch up with you again, I hope, in September, for September 10th, for Dr. Bronner's talk on sex and Parkinson's. Thanks again, Angela, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.